Great. So I think we will get started. Again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Lowe. I'm the Manager of Health Promotions here at Homewood Health. I'll be supporting Kathy, moderating tonight's webinar. So the topic of the evening is developing empathy in the workplace, and I will pass things over to my colleague, Catherine Susak.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to participate and join in tonight's webinar on developing empathy in the workplace. I am a clinical manager with Homewood Health, and I work as part of a team that oversees our national trauma care and depression care programs. This is a topic that's really close to my heart, so I encourage you to just sit and reflect and engage with the material. As Jennifer mentioned, it will be recorded, and a link for the recording will be available to you about 1 week after this evening, so you'll be able to access a link to the audio recording of tonight's webinar as well.
One more question, Kathy. A few people have put it in the Q&A. I'll just answer it here. Everyone's audio has been muted. So if you have children or dogs barking in the background, you don't need to stress out about that. Everyone has automatically been placed on mute. So you can sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Great. So in terms of what we'll be spending our time on this evening together, and in the webinar will go for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, and we'll leave time for questions and comments at the end that you can use the Q&A feature for. So looking at what is empathy and the importance of empathy, also looking at what are the limitations when we think about empathy and trying to develop empathy as a skill that we can all practice in our lives, in our personal lives, in our professional lives. Looking specifically at different types of empathy, and there's 3 types that I'll go over in this evening's webinar. Looking specifically at empathy in the workplace, what to do, what not to do, and also looking at healthy boundaries, right? So when we're thinking about empathy, looking at this as a skill that we're trying to learn and apply and practice, making sure that we've got boundaries in place as well as we're doing that. And finally, ending with self-care. And so if you have a piece of paper and a pen, you can just have that handy beside you as we start, just with a general reflection question for yourself, or you can just think to yourself as well. But if you think about from a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is extremely, right? So again, 1 is not at all and 5 is extremely. I want you to think about rating yourself in terms of these 2 questions, right? So the first question is, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. So again, 1 would be not at all and 5 would be extremely. And the second question, and using the same scale, is I try to look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I respond. So if you just take a second to consider those questions and you might think of something that's happened today or in the last week, and where you would rate yourself in terms of those 2 statements or those 2 themes. And just to note for yourself that the more you agree with statements like that, so the higher the score, the more you agree, it's more likely that the more you experience empathy, just naturally, organically, based on your own nature, right? So the higher your score, the more likely it is that you experience empathy. That's not to say that if you have a lower score or you're not sure, that it's not a skill that you can develop and apply. It's just to say that with your nature, your personality, your character, this might be something that comes more readily to you. And so if we think about empathy, empathy is really about the ability to sense other people's emotions, coupled with the ability to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. So it's really that idea of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Sometimes people use the term mentalizing when we think about empathy, being able to see a situation from the other person's perspective, and so forth. And so it's really that ability to be able to understand or kind of guess at where someone else is coming from. Thinking about if you can give someone the benefit of the doubt. For example, if you've had a difficult interaction or a conflict of some kind, or someone's kind of acting uncharacteristically, empathy might be cutting that person some slack, giving them the benefit of the doubt. It might look like considering that what the context is, that they might have other things going on in their personal life and their work life. They might not be feeling well that day, and so forth. And so the idea is really to make note of when we sense anger perhaps in another person, and instead of reacting to it, you might observe, you might notice, you might be curious about somebody else's reaction, about their response, and you might try to find a way to restore equilibrium. And also, there is this concept of compassion and empathy. And we'll look at that a bit more closer together, but that is really kind of taking it one step further of not just being able to imagine where the other person is coming from, but it's, as I said, taking it one step further in that ability to actually share and understand feelings that a person might be experiencing. Looking at how you can respond to a person empathetically. And so we're going to cover those 3 types of empathy later in this presentation and some do's and don'ts around that. Just to note that, as highlighted here, is that empathy really is a skill that can be developed. So if you find that empathy doesn't come that easily to you or that readily to you, just to know that it is a skill that we can learn and apply and strengthen. And I would also mention that if you tend to be someone who's very, very empathetic, likewise, part of working on empathy for you might be, in that sense, developing boundaries, self-care. So balancing the empathy that you're naturally able to experience, express, with making sure that you've got boundaries and self-care in place for yourself as well, right? So there's work for all of us to possibly do around this skill of empathy. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, and Jennifer is going to share a video from Dr. Brené Brown. And she is a world-renowned researcher who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and has researched a number of topics on shame, vulnerability, and empathy. And so she really defines empathy as connecting with people so that we know that we're not alone when we're in a struggle. Empathy is really a way to connect to the emotion that another person is experiencing. And what Brené Brown really emphasizes that it doesn't require us to have experienced the same experience as the other person, but being able to connect on a human-to-human level and on the emotion that the person's experiencing. So I'll pause here for now, and Jennifer is going to share that video with us.
Thank you, Kathy. Everyone give me one moment here.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, back over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love this video. I've seen it so many times, and it just really speaks to, as Brené Brown points out, connection as part of empathy. And when what we're trying to connect to is, even if we haven't had the same experience as the other person who's in pain, suffering, in distress, whatever the case may be, trying to connect in a sense, heart to heart. And I liken it to imagining what the person might be feeling. So we might not know exactly whatever experience they're going through, but just imagining, you know, is this person afraid? Are they ashamed? Are they angry? Are they worried? And connecting within ourselves to times that we have felt that way. We might not have had the same experience that they are, but what are the times when I have felt those same emotions related to difficult experiences in my life? And so the connection with the other person is really on that emotional level. And as she highlights, really sitting in the discomfort with the other person, where our job is really to try to listen if we're trying to be empathetic, and just to hold space for whatever it is that the person is sharing with us. Honoring that they are trusting us enough to share whatever it is that they might be experiencing with us, holding space for them, listening, expressing how difficult it might be, and not necessarily feeling like we need to come up with a perfect response, just allowing the person to share, holding space, and supporting them in that moment. And so, as Brené Brown highlights the difference between sympathy, and we see that I think it's a gazelle kind of peeping over the hole there at the other animal there who's having difficulty, versus the bear who actually comes down and turns on the light and says, "I feel with you," right? And there's actually connection, right? You're present. So when we think about empathy, it's really a feeling, it's an energy, it's a presence, it's really using ourselves to connect with the other person and to let them know, I'm here with you. This is difficult and I'm here with you. So in terms of the importance of empathy, so much to do with connection, with relationship, with trust, with safety. And we know from research that empathy really is a key part of emotional intelligence in terms of our relationships. And then it has a big factor to play in terms of how we communicate with others, effective communication, and positive outcomes overall. We know that people who practice empathy tend to be happier, and they attract friends more easily and tend to excel at work, right? Finally, building empathy is really a way to take care of our social health. It's really a way to take care of our relationships, to promote the connections within our life, for people around us, whether it's friends, colleagues, our children, whomever, also modeling empathy to those around us and how beneficial that can be, right? So again, like I had mentioned, empathy is going to look different depending on context. It might look like, cutting someone slack in a difficult situation. Might look like if you've had a difficult interaction, not taking it personally. Might look like taking a person's context into account. Yeah, you know what? I know this person's been having a really hard time. There's stuff going on at home. They must be going through something. It's not really like them to respond in this way, for example. Right? Likewise, as Brené Brown pointed out, although empathy doesn't require that we've experienced the same situation that someone's going through, and that really the idea is for us to be able to connect heart to heart, emotion to emotion, right? There are times where it might be inappropriate or disingenuous, not sincere, to convey that you fully understand what someone is going through. There's times where that just doesn't actually fit, right? So for example, if there's a person who is blind to their own privileged position in society, they may find it difficult to recognize how the social determinants of health could actually have a negative impact on another person's success. And so they might find it actually hard to be able to truly step into their shoes. And so in order to practice empathy and really try to understand and make a sincere effort to consider, to imagine what another person is going through emotionally, we do filter our understanding of what another person is going through our own lived experience. And so that, of course, can limit our understanding. And so in these cases, we can turn to other skills, things like compassion and kindness as well. Finally, in addition to the inability of empathy to help us reach a full understanding of another person's lived experience, the limitations of empathy, just to mention as well, are also using empathy as a way to sway people's opinions, right? And so, for example, victim impact statements to a jury, or manipulating your understanding of people to get what you want. So for example, a politician, for example, playing into what he knows or what she knows an audience wants to hear. So these are just some limitations of empathy that it's important that we're aware of. And so when we think about the 3 types of empathy, and what I would encourage you to do as we're going through these is just to reflect for yourself times that you have noticed yourself using any of these types of empathy, if there are certain types that come easier to you, maybe more difficult to you. And these are the 3 types here. So there's cognitive, emotional, and compassionate. So when we think about cognitive empathy, it's really kind of the cerebral, the brain part of ourselves, our thoughts, our thinking, and so forth, right? This is really when we're talking about being aware of the emotional state of another person, right? So you're noticing when another person's talking to you, what their behaviors are, what they're saying, what they're doing, all their nonverbal cues, and you're kind of thinking about it, reflecting, considering what they might be going through. So it's really that idea of putting yourself in another person's shoes and being aware of the emotional state of another person, right? This person seems really frustrated, or this person seems really embarrassed. This person seems really, really down, really a lot of despair. And so the ability to understand what another person may be thinking or feeling in that case. And when we're using cognitive empathy, it's really trying to understand what the other person is feeling from a rational, intellectual, or an emotionally neutral place, right? So we're fairly neutral, we're grounded, we're centered in ourselves. We're sort of observing and guessing at what the person might be thinking or feeling. Cognitive empathy could sometimes be used for negative purposes, just to note. So again, in terms of politics, so say, for example, a politician or a leader who wants to get elected in a riding with generous immigration policies might use cognitive empathy to tap into the audience's fear and distrust of newcomers to Canada, for example, fear of losing their jobs, for example, to manipulate them into voting for him or her. So just something to be aware of. Managers can use cognitive empathy as a way to determine the leadership style that members will best respond to, right? So kind of getting to know different team members, different staff, what they do respond to, noticing how people respond in terms of their thinking and their feeling to some of your perhaps management strategies, your discussions with them, how they respond to change, and so forth. When we look at the emotional empathy aspect of things, this is sometimes called affective empathy with an A, right? So it's really that feeling part of ourselves, and it's really connecting heart to heart with another person. So engaging with and sharing another person's emotions. And so this is sort of what Brené Brown was highlighting, is that really trying to connect with, okay, this person seems to be experiencing a lot of hopelessness and despair, connecting within yourself times where you have maybe felt similarly to what that person might be experiencing at this time. And so it's the ability to share the feelings of another person and create trust, create emotional safety, create rapport. It can be overwhelming and demanding and affect your own emotional well-being if you become too immersed in another person's pain. And so that's when we'll be talking about some boundaries as well in tonight's webinar. So being connected heart to heart, being aware of another person's emotional experience, their pain, their suffering, but also being mindful of your own boundaries, your own energetic boundaries, so to speak, and that you're not absorbing or taking it on either. One of the ways that we can express our emotional empathy is through things like mirroring with facial expressions. So someone is expressing to you their concern, perhaps about a health situation, about a potential diagnosis or treatment or a job stressor. Your face softens, right? You show concern in your face. You show warmth in your eyes. You make sure that your hands, your body posture is open, right? So conveying kind of that warmth, that presence, that undivided attention is one way that we can express our emotional empathy. And then moving towards compassionate empathy. So this is really the ability to share and understand feelings and respond appropriately, right? So it's really getting into it being dynamic now, where there is an exchange between yourself and the other person, and you're expressing empathy in a compassionate way. This is also sometimes called empathetic concern. And so what we're doing when we're trying to develop this skill of compassionate empathy is really taking action to support others. It's the ability to have concern for a person, share their pain, and also take practical steps to reduce it. And so this might look like asking the other person, like, this is really hard. Is there something that I can do that would be helpful to you? What's the best? Thank you for sharing with me how difficult this has been for you. I wonder if there's some way that I can support you with this. Or I was thinking perhaps that I could help you with this. Would that be helpful to you, right? So you're really getting now into that practical way of supporting the person. It's collaborative. You're engaging with the person, asking them for their ideas, their preferences on what would be helpful. Sometimes people are so overwhelmed, they have a hard time to even generate what would be helpful in that moment. So it might be offering, I was thinking I could do this for you. I could pick this up for you or drop this off or take care of this. Would that be helpful to you? Right, and just allowing the person to accept or decline whatever it is that your offer might be. And so when we think about empathy in these three types, compassionate empathy is really the most active form of empathy because we're responding to the other person. We might be offering some type of support as well. And so if you notice that someone's struggling, and we notice someone struggling by their behaviors, right? If you notice that somebody is acting differently than they typically do, we notice someone is struggling perhaps by what they're saying, what they're not saying, by their emotions, by the way that they're functioning, by the way that they're performing in the workplace, perhaps. So if we notice these clues or we see these signs that someone's having a difficult time, you might consider asking yourself these three questions. And these three questions will sort of support your own process in terms of being able to respond in an empathetic way. And so the first question to ask yourself is, what might this person be feeling, right? So really trying to make that heart-to-heart connection. And this is just a process for yourself. Tapping into yourself and trying to reflect and connect to what is the emotional experience that this person is having right now, and trying to perceive how the other person is actually feeling. You might consider at this stage actually asking questions that help the person express what's really going on, right? So I notice in the last couple meetings, you haven't said as much as you usually do, and I love hearing from you in the meetings, and I just wonder, how are you doing? Are things going okay, right? Just kind of gently checking in with the person, how they're doing, and responding in a way where you're going to affirm what they've expressed and just offering also genuine understanding, things like, that sounds really difficult, and I can see this is really hard for you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with me how you're doing. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation right now. I'm here for you. I'm here to listen. This is really hard, right? So in that first layer of connecting to how the person is feeling, really being present, actively listening. So that's where we really, really want to practice that discipline of not offering any solutions, not kind of saying at least it's this or at least it's that. It's just being present for the person, being with them in their moment of difficulty and suffering. And one of the things that requires from us as well is it's uncomfortable for us when someone is suffering and having difficulty. It's a natural inclination to want to provide relief to that person because it's also uncomfortable for us. And so part of empathy is sitting with that discomfort, right? And going back to the connection piece, really with our presence, with holding space, communicating that this is hard and I'm here with you, right? You are not alone. I'm here with you in this moment of difficulty. Taking an interest in what the person has to say without any judgment. And then going to, have I ever felt this way? So a bit of what we talked about, again, connecting for yourself. Has there been a time where I have felt some of the things that this person is expressing, the hopelessness, the despair, the outrage perhaps that they're experiencing, the frustration, the defeat, whatever it is that they might be experiencing that moment. And so it's really going beyond recognizing the other person's situation, and it's being able to imagine yourself either in the situation or being able to imagine going back to a time where you have felt some of those similar feelings. Okay. And then going to, so what is this person, or what might this person need from me? And all the while recognizing that it's really about the other person. People will have different needs and different preferences. And so when taking compassionate action, that third type of empathy, we really want to make sure that the actions align with what the other person wants and not necessarily what I would want. And so the other person may simply want us to just hold space and listen and be with them. They might want some practical support. They might want us to offer resources to them, for example. They might want us to just check in with them. And like, is it okay if I call you in a couple of days and just see how you're doing, right? So making sure that we're checking in with the person, collaborating with them, eliciting from them what would be most helpful. What I would mention too is that in these situations, it can be so tricky sometimes to even identify in terms of emotional vocabulary, what might be the person feeling, kind of going beyond mad, glad, and sad. That's a good start. But how do we get really, really specific about what the person might be feeling? When are times that I felt that way? And so what I would encourage you to do, if you're interested, is you can just Google something called like a feelings wheel. And you'll see lots and lots of resources that come up online where you can get really specific in terms of lots and lots of feeling words, which is an interesting exercise for self and also for others as you're trying to develop the skill of empathy, to broaden emotional vocabulary, being able to tap into how you might be feeling, how the other person might be feeling. And so empathy is not endorsement. It's not agreeing with what the other person might be doing or what the other person might be saying. And so just as an example, if I think about an actual example that happened with two kids, for example, and there was some kind of a squabble and one kid did something to the other kid and so forth. And so knowing that kid was having some true difficulties in terms of context and a lot of things going on and a lot of stressors and things beyond their control and not their fault. So a lot of empathy can come from that and tapping into that. And also at the same time, not endorsing, not agreeing, not excusing what they did to this other kid, right? And so it's sort of, empathy is a both and. We can express and feel empathy for the other person. We can take into consideration context, give them the benefit of the doubt and so forth, but it doesn't mean that we're endorsing, or it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going along with something that is crossing our own integrity or something that we don't agree with, right? So It's not about compromising our beliefs or endorsing something that someone else believes. Certainly we can kind of agree to disagree, but it is about connecting to that emotional piece and acknowledging someone else's humanity. Okay, so this has come up a lot actually during the pandemic, and in families and workplaces, people having different views, for example, on restrictions, for example, public health measures, and this has caused some pretty serious rifts in families and so forth. And so this is an example where you can be empathetic towards the other person, but you may not necessarily agree with their particular views. But you can have empathy for the stress that they're maybe experiencing, the powerlessness maybe that they're experiencing, the helplessness that they're experiencing, or the empowerment that they want to express without necessarily endorsing or agreeing with their specific views. And so when we think about empathy in the workplace, and we spend so much of our time in the workplace, even working remotely, spending so much of our time, of our energy with our colleagues, with our leaders, with our teams. And so empathy certainly has such an important place, an important role to play in the workplace as well. And so the research really shows that empathy is a force for productivity, life-work integration, and positive work experiences overall. Employees who report having empathetic leaders are more likely to report that they're able to be innovative and engaged. And so if you are in a leadership position and a mentorship position, it's helpful to sort of consider that showing and lending empathy to those around you, beyond it supporting the connection, the relationship, the trust and safety at work, it also is mutually beneficial in the sense that typically employees and team members, when they feel safe and supported, will feel invested, and it will lend to better outcomes. It will lend to them feeling more motivated, more engaged. It will lend to them feeling valued and seen in the workplace as well. Okay. Empathic leaders respect employee life circumstances, right? And so certainly this has become really, I think, important in the times of the pandemic, where people have had all sorts of stressors around childcare, around aging parents, and perhaps restrictions around being able to visit them, stressors around health procedures being delayed. And so all those types of really significant stressors and empathy that can be shown there really is quite supportive, especially now more than ever. Empathic leaders foster inclusion of team members. And finally, senior leader empathy is linked to reduced intent to leave. And so the research is really clear that in terms of being able to be empathetic and to show that, it really supports with building and maintaining a healthy team and staff retention overall. So one of the things in terms of practicing empathy, really about keeping the communication lines open. And so what does that look like in the day-to-day? One of the ways is really ensuring that coworkers know that they're in a safe, accepting environment, and helping them to feel supported without invading privacy. So being mindful, being aware that some people may choose to share more than others, and being prepared for that. Giving people different ways that they're able to share. So some people might feel really comfortable communicating at a meeting what might be going on, whereas other people might need other avenues to be able to share what's going on in either their personal life, if that needs to be communicated, or even having concerns about things that might be going on at work. So setting up different mediums where people can actually feel safe to communicate freely. So that might look like having surveys, it might look like having one-on-one check-ins, it might look like having anonymous ways to share feedback, and so forth. And so when we're also considering practicing empathy in the workplace, it's really about showing a sincere interest and curiosity about other people. So giving the person your full attention and practicing active listening, right? So when you're on a call with a person or a video call or what have you, really using yourself and making sure that you're able to give the person your undivided attention as you're speaking with them, right? Considering other perspectives and the role that social identity plays as well into workplace issues that come up, taking or suggesting action that aligns with the other person's needs, and finally, practicing self-compassion to build your capacity for empathy. So it's really about it being difficult to pour from an empty cup, or that metaphor of if you're flying and the oxygen masks come down, the first person you put the oxygen mask on is yourself, so that you're able to be effective and respond to those around you. And so likewise, even before we can think about learning and applying empathy with those around us, we really need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves in terms of boundaries, self-compassion, self-care, taking our own sort of mental health pulse check. How am I doing? Is there anything that I need to be doing so that I'm able to be effective and empathetic towards others? And so empathy, as we have touched upon, really is about active listening. And so we're not getting into solutions or advice necessarily, but really about using our presence to fully listen and to be with the person as they're sharing with us. Might look like listening attentively, so we're communicating with our gaze, with our nonverbals, that we're not fiddling with other stuff or on our phones or what have you, that we're really giving the person our attention. It might look like paraphrasing and reflecting back what is said without any judgment or advice, right? It might be summarizing what the person has said. Wow, that sounds really hard. So you went into work and then your colleague said this to you, and then that happened, and then this happened. Yikes, that's a lot in one day. That sounds really hard, right? Things along those lines. We're also aware of the other person's body language and our own body language. So having open body language. If you're in a leadership position, being aware of having sort of inviting body language, that you're not imposing, you're not threatening, you're relaxed. Making sure that you yourself are breathing, so that you're able to be really present in that conversation with the person, showing that you're open and engaged. Active listening is going to include asking open-ended questions, right? So we're inviting the person to share more with us if they want to, right? So what's been the most difficult? What have you found to be the most difficult about this situation? What are you worried about moving forward? What do you think might happen moving forward? Have you thought about how your workplace can support you as your leader? I'm so glad that you came and talked to me about this today. This is important to me. How might I be able to support you moving forward? Have you thought about that, right? And you can ask questions as needed to clarify, to make sure that you understand what the person's concerns are. So I'm glad you talked to me. I just want to make sure I really understand what's going on here. So the thing that's really the most upsetting for you right now is this and this, right? So really making sure that you're aligned, you're on the same page, and have a clear understanding of what the person's difficulties are that they've shared with you. And so we've talked a bit about the to-dos, and now there's just to bear in mind the not to-dos, right? And so when we're expressing empathy, we really want to stay away from probing questions. So we're really trying to be gentle, respectful, non-invasive. So we're not nosy. We're not asking like medical questions or questions about, their personal life that are not relevant to the discussion at hand, for example. And especially if there's a power differential in the relationship, not asking questions where the person might feel pressured, for example, to give you more information than they want. We don't want to challenge what the person is saying or make any kinds of like remarks or comments that suggest you question the validity of the issue. Like, oh, really? Like, that's what you're upset about? Oh, that doesn't sound that bad. I'm sure that happens all the time, right? So we don't want to invalidate what the person is saying or minimize it. We're neutral, we're non-judgmental, we're just holding space for what the person is saying. No pep talks, right? So it can be so patronizing if a person is sharing their struggle and just, I know you can get through this, you've got this, you're so strong. So not really a good route to go in terms of empathy. And we're not trying to solve problems and rush into any solutions, as we've discussed. Not trying to offer any personal advice, I remember when I went through that with my spouse. This is what we tried and this is what worked and so forth. And staying away from blaming, right? If you had done what I had told you to do or what I had suggested, this wouldn't be happening, right? Or if you had just taken care of this and not procrastinated, this wouldn't be happening. So really trying to stay away from things like that. If we go back to one of the core aspects of empathy, which is we're trying to connect, we're trying to sort of be in relationship with that person, be heart to heart, all these things that are here on the screen of things to avoid, they break connection, right? They break that sense of emotional safety. So anything that's going to break that connection are really things that we want to stay away from. And so what are some empathy misses? And we will miss because we're human. So there will be times where we're in conversation and we're preoccupied with our own concerns or our own worries, or we're distracted, or we're hungry, or we're tired, or whatever the case may be. And so I think if you reflect on your own experiences, I can imagine that there are times where people have missed the mark with you being empathetic, and likewise, we will miss the mark as well. And we're only human, right? But just to notice when we do that. So noticing when you have been on the receiving end of an empathy miss, for example. So when the person has provided sympathy versus empathy. So sympathy is kind of that pity feeling, right? Or the gasp and awe, right? And so these are those times where you're really vulnerable. You share something that's really difficult, and the person hears your story and kind of feels shame or horror or angst on your behalf. They might tell you how horrified you should be, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that, or I can't believe the other person did that. And sometimes when this happens, we feel the need to almost reassure and take care of the other person emotionally, right? So we really kind of want to stay away from that as well. The mighty fall. So that's the friend who sees you as perfect. And so they're so let down by your imperfections, and that they might feel actually disappointed in you. I just never expected that from you. I didn't think you would ever be someone who didn't do well. What happened, right? So say you have some kind of presentation, for example, at work that doesn't go well, and you confide in a friend how worried you are, how embarrassed you are, for example, and they say, like, what? You always ace that. How did that ever happen to you? I would never expect that from you. So a real empathy miss in that moment, right? The block and tackle. So this is the friend who's so uncomfortable with vulnerability that they criticize you, right? So you go to the person, you let them know that I had this really uncomfortable conversation with my child's teacher, for example, and this is what happened. And the friend is so uncomfortable with your own discomfort, with your suffering, with your pain in that moment, that they might criticize you and say, like, how could you let that happen? I've seen you handle those situations so well before. What happened to you? That's not like you at all. That's not the so-and-so that I know. Again, that would be considered an empathy miss, right? The boots and shovel. And so this is really the friend who's all about making it better, and out of their own discomfort refuses to acknowledge that you can actually make terrible choices, right? So you confide in your friend about something that you did or that you didn't do, and the friend says to you, like, it wasn't that bad. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're a rock. You're perfect. You're a superstar. Everyone loves you. They're probably so uncomfortable with your discomfort and whatever feelings that you have in that moment, that they're trying to bypass that in a way and make you feel better versus connecting with your emotions. Like, sounds like you're really embarrassed. It sounds like you really feel regretful over what happened. Yeah, that sucks. That's really hard, right? So just thinking about some of these empathy misses. If you think that's bad. And so this is where, again, a person is trying to make us feel better by saying, I've got a story that's 10 times worse, right? doesn't connect emotion to emotion, doesn't connect heart to heart. It doesn't let us know that the person is with us in our suffering, but they're over somewhere else thinking about another situation. And then finally, the I can fix that. So again, the discomfort with the suffering is so high that whoever it is that we're speaking to is racing to problem solving, solutions, options, making it better. And so most of us do struggle with this one, especially if friends often come to us for help with solving problems. And so one of the things to consider doing here is asking questions around, well, what does support look like, right? What would be helpful to you? And that kind of gives the person space and the freedom to say, just listening might help, or can you help me figure this out? Or this is what I'm thinking of doing, what do you think? And so forth. And so, as Brené Brown commented in the video, really embracing vulnerability. And when we think about vulnerability, I think sometimes is mistaken as weakness, right? But vulnerability really in the sense of showing up, of taking up space, of expressing ourselves, of showing our humanity and embracing the humanity of those around us. Sometimes when we think about vulnerability as a dark emotion, really that core of fear, shame, could be grief, uncertainty. It's those things that are really difficult to feel and that we don't want to feel. We don't want to be at risk. We don't want to be exposed. And so it takes a lot of courage actually for us to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And Brené Brown says that vulnerability is the center of difficult emotion, but it's also the birthplace of every positive emotion of love, belonging, joy, and empathy. And so if there is no vulnerability, if we don't show up with our own humanity, with our own feelings, with our own hearts, with our own selves, we actually cannot be empathetic. And in a culture where people are so afraid to be vulnerable and are so guarded and so protected and so hidden in a way, you can't actually have empathy. In order to truly be empathetic, it requires us to step into what the other person is feeling, and that's vulnerable. It requires us to kind of get out of our heads and to go into that heart feeling of what's the other person feeling? When is there a time that I have felt this way? And sitting, accompanying, walking beside that person as they're in their discomfort and not hurrying them through it necessarily. And so one of the reasons that this is so difficult is that in order for us to be able to get into that empathetic dynamic and that empathetic interaction and response is that we can't do that without reactivating our own experience of going through that without vulnerability. So if someone is experiencing a lot of fear about some unknowns that they're experiencing in their personal life, in order for me to be able to connect to that feeling of fear, I have to be able to be courageous and vulnerable to connect to a time when I experienced those feelings as well. And that's difficult to do. But by doing that, it allows us to build connection with the other person. So as I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you're someone who empathy comes really, really easily to, that is wonderful. And also one of the things to keep in mind is the importance of healthy boundaries, right? So not overextending self and just being mindful of your own boundaries and taking care of self as you're offering and practicing empathy to those around you. When I think about boundaries, I think about not too close and not too far. And so really the work of boundaries is work that all of us can do, depending on different situations, interactions, relationships. How do I have boundaries with people around me that are kind of healthy, right? Not too close and not too far. And also when we're thinking about boundaries, not just boundaries with others, but also boundaries with myself. And that's what we were talking about earlier about really checking in with myself. How am I doing? Am I able to be empathetic? Do I have the bandwidth right now to be here truly for another person and support them with their suffering, hold space for them? And so in the psychosocial realm, boundaries are things like our words, have to do with consequences, the emotional distance that we take, and so not taking on someone's pain or suffering, and so forth. So boundaries include limitations, rules, or guidelines based on values, wants, and goals. And as I mentioned, when practicing empathy towards others, boundaries are a really important part of conserving or restoring the energy that you have to give. And so thinking about boundaries with others, but also with self. And so why is it so difficult to set boundaries? Lots of different reasons. We may feel selfish, bad, or guilty about setting boundaries. We might be afraid that there will be consequences of setting boundaries. If I'm not here for this person, what might they do? What are the implications of that? If we are not there for that person, we might be afraid that that person would become angry with us, or there'll be some type of conflict. We don't want the other person to feel abandoned or rejected by us necessarily. We might want the other person to like us, right? So I want to be there for that other person. It's important to me that that person likes me and sees me in a positive way. We don't feel entitled to boundaries, right? So thinking about our own experiences, we might not yet have developed that muscle of setting boundaries with others, or even feeling that we have a right to say no, or to say not now, or not yet, or not this much, or this is what I can do, but this is what I can't do. And so possibly feeling helpless or hopeless in terms of setting boundaries, right? So what I encourage people to do is to think about empathy, to think about boundaries on a spectrum versus as a binary yes or no. When we practice providing empathy, there's a lot of gray in between. And so being aware of our own bandwidth, what's going on in our own lives, how much we're able to give in that particular moment. Okay. When we set boundaries, we really adopt an I count, you count, or I matter and you matter position. And that's something that we just tuck away in our own minds. It means that we show respect to the person that we're interacting with, but at the same time, we respect our own health, our own boundaries and needs. And then if we think about setting boundaries, it might sound like some of these examples here. This is really interesting. I'm getting a bit tired, or I'm feeling tired. I'm going to need to take a break. Can we chat again later? It might be saying to the person, yeah, I'm available to chat, but I have a hard stop at 7 o'clock. I've got another commitment that I need to attend to. This one's really hard to say. I know you're hurting. I really want to be there for you. The truth is, I'm really struggling right now too. I need some time to work on myself, and I hope I can support you once I'm in a better place. Okay. I'd really like to take that project on, but if I do, I'm concerned that the quality of my other projects will suffer. Okay. And really setting these boundaries is like developing a muscle. The more that we can practice it and have the courage to try to say some of these things, the more we'll be able to do this with some ease. And so really ending with self-care, as I mentioned, with empathy, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. So this is the 6 dimensions. This is one model, 6 dimensions of wellness: spiritual, physical, nutritional, psychological, social, and community, and intellectual. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into too much detail with these 6 dimensions, but the idea is to be well, this kind of represents 6 important dimensions for each person. And so what it would encourage you to think about for yourself, even now, which are the dimensions of wellness where you feel that you're really strong in, you've got a lot of support, you're taking care of those aspects of wellness. And then are there other dimensions that perhaps you think, oh yeah, I've kind of neglected that for a while, and I might need to give that some more attention. Self-compassion, so to be compassionate towards ourselves. And Kristen Neff has a lot of information about self-compassion on her website. If you look up her name, Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, there's tons of information on her website, as well as self-compassion exercises. But by practicing self-compassion, it really helps to build our own capacity for empathy, and it's an important part of self-care. The most important strategy that we can use for exercising self-compassion is really to become aware and monitoring our self-talk. So just noticing, what's the tape that's playing in my head? What's the story that I'm telling myself about this situation? What's my perspective? What's my interpretation? You might ask yourself, am I being kind and understanding to myself? Am I acknowledging that my own mistakes, my own shortcomings, are experiences shared by everyone? You know, it's not just me, right? This is part of my shared humanity of making mistakes. And am I keeping my negative feelings in perspective? And so in conclusion, empathy, it's something, and I think this is great, it's a skill that can be developed. It's dynamic, right? It's a muscle that we can develop. And if empathy is something that comes really naturally to you, then making sure you're also balancing that with boundaries, self-care, self-compassion, right? And empathy is really about connecting with people so they know that they're not alone, connecting with the other person's emotion, connecting to a time where you maybe have experienced that emotion, holding space for people in their suffering and just being with them in their difficult moment. It requires us to tolerate discomfort, another person's discomfort. It's a key part of emotional intelligence. It's a force for happiness, productivity, and life work integration, right? So really being fully and wholly human in our personal and our work lives and everything in between. It doesn't mean that we're endorsing or agreeing with someone's views or even their behaviors. It just means that we're connecting with the emotion and with what they might be feeling with their experience. It's about being sincere, about being engaged, about being genuine in a person's experience, and about active listening, right? Being fully present with a person, giving the person our undivided attention, and really treating someone the way that we would want to be treated in a moment of difficulty. And as we mentioned, just being mindful of when we're practicing empathy, to remember that we're setting our own boundaries with others, but also with ourselves, and practicing self-care to make sure that our own needs are being met. And so on that note, I'm just going to pause here for a moment and open up the Q&A to see if there's any questions or comments that come through. Actually, before I do that, I will just move over to the next slide here. So Wellness Together, Homewood Health is a proud lead partner in the Wellness Together Canada initiative. And so there's mental health and substance use support available to all Canadians. There's lots and lots of excellent resources. And so you can learn more about how to access these through the website wellnesstogether.ca or by calling 1-866-585-0445. It is available in both English and French. Okay, so I'll just start to go through some of these questions here, and if you have others, please do feel free to add to them. So one person is asking, feelings are not encouraged at work. It's all about the silver lining. Are there any thoughts on how that can change? Yeah, what a great question. And, you know, I can think about workplace situations where you know, someone was crying and how that was perceived, for example, right? And so it's so true that depending on different cultures on teams, people can get very, very uncomfortable with other people's feelings. And so in terms of thoughts on how that can change, I mean, I think it's going back to self. And so looking at for yourself, who are those people at work, whether they're colleagues, whether they're leaders, where there's a certain safety there where you can express what your feelings are. You can express difficulties that you might be having. And so kind of knowing who your audience is, who do you trust, who's going to respect, who's going to honor you sharing whatever difficulty it is that you might be having. Comment about this statement. I love the statement, empathy is not endorsement. This can be hard to manage in the work environment, especially during this challenging time when so many feelings are involved in all conversations. Can you provide some examples of how to respond without getting into the emotion with them without enabling their behavior, which is a result of their feelings. Okay. Yeah, so really going back to boundaries about, and it's really a balancing act, right? Connecting with a person, but having boundaries and not kind of taking on their pain or suffering necessarily, not enabling their behavior. And so I think it's kind of that both and position. And I really am a firm believer in being honest and leveling with people. And so the point about not enabling behavior, it might sound something like, I can see this is really, really painful for you and difficult for you. And I'm so glad that you've shared this with me. And also, these are some of the expectations in the workplace, right? Some of the things that need to happen in the workplace or in the role are X, Y, and Z. So how do you think we might be able to make that happen? Or what are your ideas on how you can get the support that you need while still meeting the expectations that are required at this time? So I think it's a both and, where you're going to validate their feelings, validate how difficult it is, eliciting from them what are their ideas, what are kind of the solutions to their own problems, so to speak, offering your support, what may or may not be possible. How do you deal with empathy seekers in the workplace? Yeah, so yeah, making sure that, you know, people aren't necessarily monopolizing per se, that you're making room, that there's safety for people to express difficulty, but still setting boundaries so that it's comfortable, appropriate, respectful for all people. And so one of the things might be having, again, depending on your role, conversation with a person about, you know, what is kind of appropriate to share, let's say in a team setting. What is appropriate to share with their leader? What is appropriate to share with their colleague? If they are having difficulty, if they are needing some support in the workplace, what can they do during the day, for example, to be able to get some support? So I think it's about acknowledging if they're having difficulties, and then really getting into the practical about how can they access support, what are the resources available to them, what are their options in terms of being able to get some support. Okay, a question coming in about how do you reconcile empathy with accountability in the workplace? Yeah, great question. So I think what comes to mind with that question is that empathy is not endorsement. And it can be a fine line in some of these situations, as we all know, can be very murky. And so it can be difficult to kind of balance and reconcile all of that. But reconciling empathy with accountability, when we think about empathy, it's about connecting to the person's suffering, the difficulty, the feeling, their experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not accountable in whatever their role might be. And so I think it might be, if you're a leader, for example, or if you're a colleague and you're working on a project or whatever it might be expressing empathy, but then also letting the person know what you are and are not able to do, how much flexibility is there not around task, role, project, that kind of thing. So another question's come in about how to remain empathetic. How to remain empathetic with a person who might overshare and does not seem to have any self-awareness. Yeah. Well, I think it's really about kind of that emotional vocabulary that I had mentioned earlier. And so if a person is oversharing, I think it's about, again, depending on the situation, but going high level, not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty details of the difficulty that they're experiencing, but really connecting to the emotion. That and one of the ways that you can support the person in that case is even helping them to get clarity on whatever emotion they may be experiencing. So that sounds really, really difficult. Like, I wonder what comes up for you as you're going through this. Is it fear? Is it sadness? Is it anxiety? Like, what's going on for you? So helping them, depending on your role, of course, in your relationship with the person, to get some clarity on what's their own emotional experience of what they're going on, and not necessarily getting into all the minutia of the situation. Okay, and then there's a last question in here. Oh, so good. With more and more work interactions being over video calls, what tips or advice do you have to convey moments of empathy when you're not in the same room? Yeah, great question. I think one of the things is really undivided attention. So even though we're on video calls, even if we're on phone calls, we've all been on the other end of a phone or a video call where you can tell the other person's not paying attention, right? And so I think one of the best things we can do is give our undivided attention. We give our undivided attention by not doing anything else, by maintaining eye contact, by responding. If it's a phone call, acknowledging with our comments that we're present and we're there. It might be making a comment and saying, thanks for sharing this with me. I just want to check in with you. This sounds really, really difficult. Thanks for sharing with me. That kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for now. And I'm mindful of the time, and I just would like to thank everyone for taking the time to participate in this evening's webinar. Really appreciate the fantastic questions that have come through. And if you are interested, you will be able to access this link about a week after this evening's recording. So I'll pause here for now. Thank you very much, everyone.